China, 1.4 billion people on the planet who have smartphones and a totally different tech scene. What do we need to understand about that world? Let's find out. Today we're sitting down with Rui Ma. She is a very old friend of mine who also runs one of the top Chinese tech podcasts.
Yep.
What's it called and how do we find it?
It's called Tech Buzz China, and then you could just go to any platform and we'll be there.
That's awesome. And what kind of stuff do you like to talk about?
Basically, I talk about China tech, but it's with a heavy emphasis on internet. So consumer internet, primarily because that's really a lot of the big Chinese internet companies, that's what they're doing.
There's just so much happening in China and it feels like the media environment is completely separate. It doesn't make sense that it's worlds apart. And we sort of share a hardware platform, we share like software platform, but I don't think people pay attention to what's happening with Chinese companies like nearly enough. And
yeah,
I'm glad for what you do. Thanks for doing that.
Thank you.
Why did you start the podcast?
I thought there was an opportunity to more clearly bridge a divide that I saw between English coverage of Chinese tech companies and then what actually was happening on the ground in China. Well, there are certain companies that are really popular in the media or with the media here in the US and are actually viewed quite skeptically in China, for example, and that there are other companies that are viewed very strongly in China that might not get a lot of airtime here in the US, but that are really interesting. And so I look primarily at actually Chinese language coverage, and I lived and worked in China for 8 years. So I try to use my knowledge and cultural understanding to bring that. Yeah.
What's the most extreme example of this?
What's the most extreme example of this? One of the more extreme examples of recent years is a company called Luckin Coffee, which basically does delivery-only coffee. In China, there's a lot of skepticism about the company, but in the US, I think that they have, also there's some balanced coverage, but overall, I felt like that they were covered more favorably here.
How do you think that happens? Reporters here can't get access to the right people to sort of vet the story properly.
I think basically the reason why that happens is that there are certain narratives that come more naturally to Western audiences. So it's just more interesting because it's more familiar, whereas there are lots of things that are more unique to China that are just difficult to explain without having to provide a ton of context.
That sounds
right. So in the case of Luckin, they sort of just used one word to explain their business, and the word was Starbucks, which I think everyone here can understand. But if you take another company in China like Qutoutiao, which is a short video app that does live streaming e-commerce, all these other things, it's just much harder to explain because there's no Western analog.
The size of the market seems actually, just in terms of number of consumers, quite a bit bigger than the American internet audience.
Yes, by a lot, yeah.
Yeah. There's a crazy amount of competition for the eyeballs in the West. There was a much bigger opportunity for sort of the media side and the consumer side in China over the past 10 years than anything in the United States, especially on the sort of startup side. Like you just saw these really, really fast ascents of companies in the new smartphone age on the China side.
Yeah. And part of that is, part of that is easy to explain, just that there was far less desktop penetration, right? So when people got connected to the internet, it was through the mobile device.
Where do you think we are on that spectrum of sort of mobile penetration?
Actually, we just did an episode on that. It's called 2019 Year in Review, but basically that was one of the primary highlights, that mobile penetration has effectively stopped because 1.4 billion people in China, you have about, almost 1 billion on the smartphone, so there's just not that much to go.
Totally.
I think the growth was only low double-digit millions. The growth in 2019 was definitely very low compared to years before, where there were just like tens of millions of people come online. You don't really have to do anything. So if you are a smartphone app developer, then your market size is just organically expanding. So you just have to kind of keep up with the market.
What do you think, sort of startup founders in the West, what are some of the things that you find they least understand, or that they really need to? It's the future of consumer behavior, or
well, I would actually say that it in itself is a misconception in many ways, right? So there are sort of two dominant narratives about China tech, and one is they're the future. The future is right there. If you want to know what's happening, you go there, and it's like sort of you time travel.
Interesting.
And then the second narrative is like they steal everything, and everything there is actually fake or weak or
I feel like
whatever.
that was a narrative 10 years ago, or maybe 5 years ago, and then maybe 5 years ago or 3 years ago it flipped over.
It flipped over. Okay.
That's
I think there's still a good amount of people who believe the latter. That Chinese companies are inherently weak, and that they're propped up because a Western competition has effectively been fenced out of the country, which is not untrue. And I would say there's a lot of nuance to both perspectives, right? So for the second narrative that we just talked about, basically there's a lot of domestic competition.
Right.
So it's not that the companies are weak. The companies are the strongest of the native Chinese ecosystem, and that actually makes them quite strong because it's very competitive there. The first narrative about China having is so much far ahead in terms of consumer internet in particular, I would say I disagree with that. That's not necessarily true. They have very different business models because there is different consumer behavior because of the greater ecosystem, right? Especially when we're talking about consumer internet e-commerce, then you got to look at what does the rest of the retail landscape look like. You got to look at for entertainment, then you got to look at what does the rest of the traditional, for example, media landscape look like, because that's what will push people into or out of digital consumption formats.
I mean, it sounds like we have some misconceptions.
Yeah.
In the West, it seems like startups and services, consumer services in particular, can really only do one thing.
Right.
And then the China super app is so different. Like these apps can do everything seemingly. An app is almost the OS. Maybe it's just a function of that the OS itself is whether it's Android or iOS, is owned by American companies, and so it's sort of a natural outgrowth of like political power. Why is it that there are super apps in China and they're just don't seem to be the same? Facebook tries, but people still just open the news feed.
I assume you're referring to super apps like WeChat or Meituan's apps.
And they're just incredibly deep, right?
They're incredibly deep. Yeah, well, part of it is because they are transaction oriented, right? They're not advertising oriented. So what they're doing is that their value to you is allowing you to do things, right? To their main utility for you is to do transactions versus spend more time on it. Which just, I think, naturally leads to a different way of thinking about what your platform should look like.
They're not trying to eat all of your spare time.
Exactly, and how people should be able to plug in. WeChat, frankly, like very simply, we've done a ton of episodes on WeChat. Their, quote unquote super app, a lot of the other functions are from other applications, right? They just see themselves as a platform. Really, the only thing they, sort of own is sort of the payment. But everything else is pretty much like third party. And that's something that you can do if your primary goal is to facilitate transactions. But if your primary goal is to hog time and hog advertising, then that's probably not an intuitive move for you. On the smartphone, if you think about it, apps provide the better experience than a non-mobile optimized web page, right? So, and that's what I think WeChat has done really well. Like, so specifically their mini programs are effectively like, you can think of them like rich web pages that are highly interactive, right?
Obviously, we're in the middle of coronavirus, and
oh no, yeah.
With your friends in China, I mean, what's happening? What's it like? And is that how much do you look at that and see? Well, that might be what we have in store in the West.
Well, so a lot of my friends in China got themselves out of the country. Either before, because it happened to be around Chinese New Year, so a lot of people were actually on vacation. Yeah, so they just simply didn't return. Those who were in the country, I think as the quarantine has sort of dragged on, and especially those with children, because school's not restarting, they actually just decided to leave the country. Those who are still there and working, My understanding is that this week, the week that we're recording, which is like the last week of February, it's already started to ramp up, right? But if you look at just overall across the economy, it's still a fraction of what it was at the same time last year.
Right.
Actually, about 1/6 the traffic. I certainly hope that is not going to be what's in store for California.
Yeah.
But
the
we'll
tricky
see.
thing. Yeah. It's tricky because they're not really testing people here, so we don't actually have accurate numbers, but
Yeah, we don't know. Well, yeah, exactly. Well, they're not testing. I think that's what happened in the beginning of the China epidemic as well. There's lack of testing kits. There's lack of, centers that can do it. So basically, unless you were severely ill, you are not tested.
it's funny to watch the market sort of react only now when, the information about it was sort of out and about for like more than a month. And I guess there was just sort of this trust that it wasn't going to come over here.
The stock market, right?
Yeah, just the markets broadly, right?
I actually tweeted about that because I was listening to a podcast about the markets, and then the two co-hosts, is a very popular podcast, and the two co-hosts were basically saying that the markets are generally right and that people usually freak out more than, or that the media specifically freak out more. But yeah, as we can see this week, the markets are legit freaking out.
Yeah. Well, let's hope there's a floor. The funny thing is 2 or 3 weeks ago, when I talked to people about the markets when it came to coronavirus, they were pretty convinced that, well, the governments are going to print money until it's fixed. And then the difficult thing is that, it really impacts the small to medium-sized businesses the most.
Yes.
Like the large businesses have cash hoards and it's fine.
Yeah.
And they can borrow. And that would be sort of my worry. If you're like relaxing credit, the banks don't really extend that to sort of like the most vulnerable parts of any business economy, not just in China, but worldwide.
Yeah, in China, that's definitely the case.
So I'm worried about the startups. I'm worried about the little guy. It seems like they're the most vulnerable through like a pandemic situation like this.
Well, in China, the government has instituted policies that will hopefully help, right? They've asked, landlords and governments to forgive rent, taxes, for a few months, etc. And then one thing maybe that's interesting for your crypto audiences is that, so I think one of the main themes you saw in this whole crisis in China is that the businesses who are most digitized and who are most automated are doing the best, are the most resilient, right? So I mean, digitalization means anything from like very simple, just keeping your documents like electronically, because when you're stuck at home, you can't like go to the office and like do all these things. And then when you resume work, actually, people in China, they have to sign all these agreements saying that they'll keep themselves healthy, they'll check themselves in if they have a temperature, all this stuff. And you need to collect it from all your employees, for example, before you can start resuming work. And that's led to a spike in e-signature companies, makes sense. Right? Yeah, totally. Because previously these are all collected on paper, but now everyone's like, oh, great, I want contactless.
Right. This should be
ways
a mini
of working.
app.
They are. Yeah, it is. Yeah, you take digitization to the fullest extent, which is if all your transactions are digitized, and specifically in this case, I'm talking about Ant Financial has a supply chain blockchain. So what they're doing is, if all your stuff is on their blockchain, then what they'll do is they'll give you a loan on your accounts receivable.
Oh, interesting.
So that if you are one of those tiny businesses that just need, couple weeks or a couple months of cash flow, because they don't need to check with anyone, they don't need to go to the bank or anything, they're just like, all right, we see it, here's some cash.
I wonder if that's one of the largest current deployments of the use of blockchain.
I think again, this product was released just a year ago, last year, and probably people didn't really understand, specifically during this crisis. It's clear that it's superior to not being on it for the small businesses. And again, it goes to show that for China, I think the epidemic will be really interesting in, for a very long time, enterprise software and just like, efficiency in general is not necessarily like the highest priority in many organizations. But now you have this virus.
You have to,
and sort of like you actually can't function unless things are digitized or contactless in some way.
That's right. I mean, remote work in the West has just become almost existential, at least for San Francisco.
Yeah.
It's like for tech, for tech startups in San Francisco, everyone I know is either opening offices elsewhere or
Yes.
considering,
Yeah.
if you're starting something new, I'm seeing a lot of remote first.
Mhm.
Like it's not like add remote later. It's
Right.
literally like we're not going to have an office.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
And then I think this is going to accelerate that a bit.
Yeah, this is going to accelerate that, well, a ton now that, it's coming to the West as well. But in China, where it was like culturally, I don't want to say it was culturally unacceptable, but honestly, kind of.
This is the 996 culture.
Yeah, kind of. Exactly, 996.
What is 996?
996 is people working 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week.
Yeah.
Very,
That's
very
a lot
common.
of work.
Yeah, it's very, very common. And again, like in China, I mean, just to give you an example of like, in general, the management tends to want to keep a very close eye on its employees. So the sort of Slack equivalent in China, right? DingTalk, WeChat, whatever. They actually have, they'll actually geolocate you because
Always, yeah.
yeah, exactly, because it's very important that the
You're
boss
like, you're
can
in Bali?
see.
Why are you in Bali?
So, and they punch in and out, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
you would think that like, oh, I'm a software developer or whatever, I'm a white collar worker.
Mhm.
But no, like actually, your boss is very much expecting you to be at your seat in the office by a certain
Yeah.
amount of time.
I mean, here there's
Yeah.
definitely a sense that there's, sort of 10x engineers. There are
Mhm.
certainly people who can, sit there in put a butt in a seat for a long time. But,
Mhm.
there are some people who can do the work of 10 engineers with
Yes, yeah,
like, 40
yeah.
hours a week.
Yeah,
And-
it's basically the focus on output, which
Right.
is more rational, versus in China there's still a lot of emphasis on input.
If you look at the model of every on-demand business,
Mhm.
profitability is almost always predicated on density.
Yeah,
And in China, you not only have a very different sort of labor cost model,
right.
you also have incredible amounts of density.
Yes,
Um,
yeah.
And so that was always interesting to see. Like these on-demand businesses are just like not great here, but incredible in China.
But even then, something that's changing as well is even with the great density, the service workers required to support these on-demand businesses, like
Mhm.
couriers, like whatever, like these sort of, I wouldn't call them super unskilled, but relatively speaking, you don't need a bachelor's degree, so they're still considered blue collar work in China. They're running out of people wanting to do these jobs.
Interesting.
And so it's becoming automated, right? Like the next big thing is like
Autonomous.
service robots.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Service robots, that makes sense.
Mhm. And the virus is again accelerating that, because some things like right now you literally like you do want the robots to do, right? Like there are all these people making disinfectant robots.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So like shining UV lights and just like literally spraying the room with, I don't know, bleach or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The robotic sort of revolution has been a long time coming. It's
Mhm.
almost become somewhat of a red herring for people because
Yes.
generations and generations of venture investors have like sort of lost their shirts on it. 'Cause
Yeah.
It's always sort of around the corner. The weird thing is we do think that Nvidia and AMD GPUs, especially at sort of mobile scale,
Mm-hmm.
are finally good enough for real-time high definition computer vision.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of like the beginning part of being able to do practical robotics. So
Yeah.
we're definitely really interested in that space. We funded a company called Freedom Robotics, for
Okay.
instance, that's the infrastructure and analytics for basically any fleet of robots.
Mm-hmm.
And so it does telematics, all of the things you actually need to run a fleet of 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 robots. Why did the iPhone exist? The iPhone exists because you could finally have a device with that compute and that memory and that display
Mhm.
for that cost, for a cost that was low enough that crazy early adopters were willing to pay for it. That's the story of tech broadly.
Yeah.
It's a toy, it's a toy, it's a
Toy,
toy, it's
toy.
research,
Yeah.
research, it's like Apple Newton,
Yeah.
General Magic, and then finally the iPhone.
Right. Yeah. No, I absolutely agree. I think it's starting to become economical. Even countries like China, where the wages are much lower.
Oh, I have to ask about EHang. Do you ever follow that company? That's the
The drone
they
company.
they're like public now.
Yeah, they're public. They had a
on
very tiny
NASDAQ.
IPO.
Yeah, it's like 500 mil
Yeah.
market cap or something. So EHang is a startup that I've been tracking for a number of years, just
Uh-huh.
because it's manned drone, single person and 2-person drone flights.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, drones meet air taxis.
Yep. There used to be just purely a drone company.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and it was about maybe 3-4 years ago that they sort of said, hey, we're going to do these drone taxis, air taxis. I think that's what they're calling them.
Yeah, the air taxi thing.
Yeah, and that's
I'm
what
like,
they
I
want.
want it now.
Yeah.
Hook it
That
up
is
right
what
now.
they want public with in terms of their story. But I remember reading, I think I briefly looked at their prospectus, that they're not like in production or anything.
No,
Yeah,
yeah.
they're still in R&D. So it is
It's a safety thing.
I know.
They've done thousands of flights, but yeah, there's not commercialization. How do you think China deals with these sort of science fiction companies or these sort of like hard tech companies in a different way than the West?
In terms of fundraising, if you're talking about from private investors, I think it's very much the same.
Yeah.
People are, either they buy your story or they don't.
Right. I mean, here we have, in the West we have the Hyperloop, which, hit covers of every magazine, but I don't think we're going to see a Hyperloop anytime soon.
Yeah, in China they call it raising money by PPT, so by PowerPoint.
That makes sense.
They're like, oh, that's a PowerPoint entrepreneur.
That's funny.
Yeah, actually
That's
a lot of
pejorative then.
Yeah, a lot of people in China call the entire electric vehicle sector actually.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, the sector that raised money by PowerPoint. I mean,
what do they think of Tesla?
I think Chinese people in general really like Tesla. Yeah.
I guess, well, because they're shipping, I guess.
Yeah,
That's the
they're
difference
shipping. It's
between
already there.
PPT.
Yeah. And to be fair, like at least 2 of the electric vehicle companies are already shipping in China. Yeah. And there's a ton of other sort of more traditional EV companies that are, but their cars are kind of ridiculous. They're more like golf carts with batteries.
Yeah.
But like the real sort of like competitive automobiles that are electric powered, I would say, there's a handful that are already shipping. So it's not like they're completely full of hot air. Fundraising, however, in China, you can get, like, there are certain sort of waves, right? So the government will have certain sectors that they're really interested in supporting. Mm-hmm. And then there'll be, the difference in China is that in the US, if you said, the government thinks this is a really important industry, private investors typically might like roll their eyes and be like, unless that really
we're all
fits
libertarians
it.
over here. It's like, oh, the government can possibly be doing something smart. It's probably graft. I don't know.
Yeah, but in China though, like if the government's like, hey, we're really focused on this sector, and there'll be a lot of actual private money that'll tag along.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So and it'll be like a much more sort of cohesive thing, in which case then it could still fail. Like if you look at like sort of co-working, I wouldn't necessarily say that was a massive success here or in China, but in China there for a time period there was a lot of like subsidies into co-working. But now in China, for example, semiconductors, especially semiconductors for new technologies like autonomous driving and whatnot, are definitely very much sectors that the government wants to put money in. And then so you'll see that in fundraising there'll be sort of like a lot of enthusiasm all at once. And it'll be much more uniform and easy to detect versus here you still have to like the individual fund's thesis matters, whereas there's sort of like a macro thesis.
What's the current state of bike sharing? I mean, there's just these ridiculous photos of like giant piles of bikes.
Yeah. It's pretty much
just sort of like emblematic of like overflow of capital and like misallocation of funds at some level, right?
Yeah. I would say that the entire industry has suffered a demise, pretty much.
People still use them though.
Yes, but far less frequently.
There was actually sort of the shark fin aspect of, oh, this is a cool thing, and then there's a drop off, like people just revert to walking or
and a part of it is not necessarily because the idea, like the concept doesn't work. It's just that the execution was poor, right? Like if you so the 2 major players basically had different philosophy. One was, we'll build a sturdier bike, but it's heavy, but it's going to be better in the long run, right? It's going to have less repair costs, but it's heavy, so it's not great to ride anyway. And then the other player, the other major player, was lightweight. We're going to do $30 bikes. And then, by the way, they just like break. They're barely working.
That's a little wasteful.
Yeah, so there's still one or two players that you can still see their inventory on the street these days, but they are more like advertising supported, and they just have like much larger platforms, and they're lead generation for other things.
That makes sense.
Yeah, so the bike sharing by itself as a business model doesn't work.
Yeah.
It has to lead to some other transaction.
I guess there's a perception in the West that a startup that comes about in China needs to sort of ally itself with one of the big sort of mega operators, like one of the big, here we talk about the big five startups. Perhaps a few years ago we talked about the BAT.
Yeah.
Where are we at today in 2020? Like, who are the big players? And as a startup coming up, do you need to ally yourself with one of them? Can you get all of them, or maybe it doesn't matter today?
It's not a super must that you go with one of them. It's not BAT anymore, but it's basically like Alibaba, Tencent, and then to some extent, maybe ByteDance is a little bit more active now. It's very, very rare for you to get both of them. That almost never happens because they hate each other. You have Alibaba in e-commerce and Tencent in sort of social networking media. If you're a new startup, I definitely think that you're going to get pressure from one of the sides to get investment from them if you're successful.
Every new, whether it's a new product or service, if it can get product market fit and grow very quickly, sooner or later, some tech giant, no matter what market you're in, will have some sort of interest in it as basically some sort of technological moat.
Yeah, that's exactly what's happening in China. The Chinese companies, they are very strategic, but at the same time, there is still like a good amount of coordination that has to happen between the investment itself and the operations, right?
Yeah.
So it really depends on who is sort of pushing for the investment. If it's obviously going to be most strategic and easiest for integration to happen if a business unit itself like organically says, hey, I think we should be in this business, and then takes it to the investment team. But that's not, my understanding is that's not always how it works. So there are plenty of investments, I think, where at least in the beginning it starts off having not necessarily so much strategic significance.
What advice do you have for startups today that have product market fit in the Western markets and want to enter China?
I think you gotta have some like core technological advantage, or it's like a really good fit for like we were saying earlier, one of the really large internet companies that you could partner with, because otherwise
you need a partner.
You don't necessarily need a joint venture. You could just open up an office, but you would probably want to have some kind of strategic partner. Exactly, you need friends, right, to tell you what's going on, or else, unless your technology is so defensible. I think what's interesting is that what I would say to all the founders who if they're watching this would be basically like, just get a visa and go to China. Well, after the virus is over,
totally.
But just go there and see for yourself, because you'll be able to tell like what's hype and what's not. It'll be, again, when you go there, do know that unless someone's taking you into the countryside, you are seeing sort of like the best parts, the most presentable parts of China.
If you're in Shenzhen or
Shanghai, if you're Beijing, right, then it's like looking at Manhattan, going like, this is the U.S. Right?
Can you walk people through the different tiers of cities? That I thought that was always an interesting idea. That the Chinese cities are so vast that they're like tier 4 or tier 5 cities that are larger than Manhattan easily.
Right. Yeah, there are like over 300 cities in China that have over a population of 1 million. There's like 4 first-tier cities: Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, and there's about 17 what's called second-tier or new second-tier cities, and these include like Hangzhou, where Alibaba is, and a bunch of other cities. Wuhan, for example, people would have heard of by now, and it's basically organized by GDP, right? So it's how much GDP does this city generate. So there are, in China, because the population is 1.4 billion, then there are still quite a few cities that have millions in population, but might be GDP-wise not that strong.
Right.
So they would be considered a third, fourth tier city.
And yet that city might still be the world's center of manufacturing
For
some
something,
fundamental
for
thing.
buttons or something.
Right.
Yeah.
I was thinking buttons, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the funniest example.
Yeah, and then, but just the first and second tier cities is alone is about a couple hundred million. But urban population is usually considered 400 million, and that's usually maps to first and second tier cities. And then third tier and fourth tier cities and below, it goes all the way down to like fifth tier, and then you're in villages and townships. That's about 1 billion people. So that's about like what's 70% of China's population, and that population is considered quote unquote rural, and they have just very different ways of using the internet, and they just have very different consumer habits from urban populations. Like one great example that I always like to tell is so everyone probably knows ByteDance, maker of TikTok. Their first product was this AI news app called Qutoutiao. Tencent actually invested in a company that did Qutoutiao, but for the rural population specifically, Qutoutiao.
Yeah.
They paid people like pennies to read
So they
news,
cloned it.
basically. Yeah. I mean, well, whatever. It's not that complicated, right?
Yeah.
It's just like a platform where people can
totally.
submit news,
The
and
idea's
then
out there, yeah.
it pushes you through algorithm. And what's really interesting is when we visited this company, they basically said, hey, just so you understand the level of people that we're targeting, because like a lot of the investors I was with couldn't understand, like, are you saying people are like using this app for an hour a day for like a payout of like pennies? Why would
That
they
sounds
do
like
this?
All Advantage.
Yeah.
Do you remember that?
Well, like what?
All Advantage.
No, I don't remember.
I don't know. It was this like first .com scam thing where it would pay you to look at ads.
Look ads. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's exactly what this
Right.
company does, right?
Yeah.
But then people were like, "Why would you do that?" And then they were like, "Guys, it's because they're basically poor and they
Yeah.
have a lot of time. They don't have other entertainment. So what are they gonna do, right?
Wait, why don't they
they'd
farm virtual goods in like World of Warcraft and things instead?
I don't think
they
I don't
pay
think
more
that.
than pennies.
I
for
don't think that. I don't think it pays that much anymore.
Oh, really? That
Well, also
doesn't
these
work
are like
anymore.
older. These are also older people, right?
yeah.
Like aunties and uncles, right?
Yeah.
And then, but their point was like, just to give you an example of like the lifestyles of these people. Their most popular article, like in summer of last year, was how to use a microwave. Right? Like these were people who are like getting the installation of their first microwave ever, right?
Yeah,
so
totally.
so of course for them, maybe like getting paid a few pennies when they're doing something they otherwise would be doing is actually makes sense.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's what I would say if you are a founder, right? Like when you do look at headlines from China, make sure you understand what kind of customer they're trying to service, because there's just like a large spectrum of user behaviors.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's emblematic of like the Chinese miracle overall of the past, 15, 20 years. Just literally just this unbelievable rise of a middle class within that country. So, plus the smartphone. I mean, it's just unbelievable. Like the two of those things combined make China like the craziest economic miracle. Awesome. Thanks for hanging out.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
techbuzzchina.com. Go find them on where you get your podcasts and get up to date on what's actually happening in China. Great. Thanks a lot for hanging out.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yay. Okay.
That's awesome.